All right, let's finish this up. So when last we left, we've been talking about natural disasters, wildfires. We've been talking about environmental racism and increase in conflict as temperatures go up, and how militaries around the world think that climate change is a threat multiplier to be taken very, very seriously. So let's talk about the fragile state index. Every year, a group of political thinkers, economists, people from a variety of walks of independent and academic think tanks produce what's called the Fragile State Index. And they have these 12 categories in order to assess when something is a fragile state. So social cross-cutting, economic, social cohesion, economic issues, and political issues. And each of these, they divide into three separate aspects, where if a country or a political territory has some of these, they think that it is more at risk of falling apart than if it lacks some of these. So the most recent analysis was last year, and it found that there were a lot of places that were at alert levels that we should really worry about. So Democratic Republic of the Congo, what have we got? Is that that's Syria, I want to say Somalia, but I might be wrong. So there are certain places around the planet that are particularly dangerous, and there's other places that they think are not at much risk to fall apart. So the United States is fairly stable. We would have to have a pretty bad pretty bad outcome from, say, an international pandemic or something of the sort for things to take a really bad turn. But we can do this, right? So you can go do comparative analyses, and let me see if I can share my screen this time. I'm pretty sure it is a possibility. 1 second. So how are you guys doing? Enjoying this very weird state in which we now exist and now have to live? Okay. So let's try this new share. There we go. Fragile state index. You can compare this on your own time if you like. Compare different countries. So you can see how these countries have gotten more or less stable over time. So according to this analysis, from basically 2014 to now, the United States has become, Canada has become more stable. From 2016 to now, the United States has become less stable. Now, I don't know, the reasoning for this is the United States is more factionalized elites. Security apparatus is a bit stronger here. There's a bit more of an economic decline and uneven development here than in Canada. The state is viewed slightly less legitimately. More human rights issues, little more external intervention. some of these, depending on your political leanings, you might completely agree with, you might disagree with. But I need to put this in perspective so that people don't go thinking that this is a very partisan outfit. So let's, for example, compare China, Canada, the United States, Australia, let's see, Mexico, it's a good country. I like Mexico. Norway is a decent country. United Kingdom. And then let's just throw Somalia in there and see how it goes. So when you're comparing the United States and Canada, it seems like they're judging us harshly, but the numbers completely wash out when you put other countries in, right? So Somalia is much, 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 much worse in terms of likely to fall apart than the United States and Canada, where the differences between them at this scale are pretty minimal. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Norway, it's very, very stable. And then Mexico and China are hanging out here in a relative medium stability. So compare factionalization of Somalia versus China, Mexico, and then the United States. Flight and brain drain, basically most people try to leave Somalia. Some people try to leave Mexico and China. Uneven development, economic decline, etc. Okay, the reason that we're doing this is so that this next part will make sense. When we talk about the effects that climate change might have, it's important to realize that we live in a long-term changing global world in which the very same effects of the climate can have very different impacts in even very closely neighboring countries. So, what are some risk factors? Competition for scarce resource, lots of migration, social structures that privilege one group over another, demographic and economic inequities and inequality, lootable resources, that is, things that can be taken that may retain their value, unlike those things that are taken and lose their value. And the reason the climate matters is because the climate is not going to care about political borders and boundaries. There's the spread of disease, pollution. Spread of disease is probably something to take seriously right now. Dust from farming practices, runoff, fisheries, etc. All of these don't care about national boundaries. And yet, whether a nation is stable or not will drastically change how it responds to these impacts. And so, as an example, I want to talk about the Arab Spring. Some of you may remember this from your youth. I guess 10 years ago, you were all in elementary school, middle school. So the Arab Spring starts about 10 years ago, when there's some climate stresses that start affecting most good sections of North Africa and the Middle East. And there's a variety of consequences. Basically, all of the consequences happened in different places. There's a civil war, a couple of civil wars, a couple of overthrown governments, and these were spilled all over. Some people think that Twitter and other social media had lots to do with this. I want to particularly zoom in on Syria. So Syria had one of the worst consequences during this time period. where it was a country that was vastly misusing its resources, its natural resources, had very inefficient farming, overpumped groundwater, lots of overused water. The ground was overgrazed, the population was growing very quickly. It was becoming more increasingly affluent. And so, as I said, people eat meat the richer they get. Meat consumes 10 times as many resources and is responsible for more than half of climate consequences. So it leads to needing more and more land. And if you are in a tumultuous place or in a particularly risky political situation, that can lead to problems, especially when there's land degradation and water insecurity. So Syria is roughly the size of North Dakota, 22 million people. Was considered a developing country, had some middle income, right? So roughly the same level below the poverty line as the United States, at least as of 2007. I think the numbers would be very, very different for both countries right now. In 2007, about 10% of the population were refugees. A lot had been displaced from Iraq, from the war in Iraq. It was a corrupt government. So what happens? Well, you have over a long period of time, increasingly bad seasons, to the point that in 2007, the vast majority of farms suffered total crop loss. A lot of people were subsistence farmers, and so they ended up having to sell their crops and their land very cheaply and moved into the city. So there's these droughts, they move into the city. A lot of these are extremely poor people. These are climate refugees within their own country. In addition to the 10% that were already refugees from the destabilized Middle East after the Iraq War. And so the youth started rebelling against the authoritarian system. The government cracked down pretty violently. And here I'm just going to tell you a name, Hamza Ali al-Khatib. If you want to look that up, do so. If you do not want to read about a 13-year-old being tortured and how it spawned a civil war, or at least was one of the factors that led to a civil war, please don't. It is pretty disturbing. So over the next couple of years, the Syrian that had moved into the city were the divisions between the population and the government, and then ISIS and other fighters came in and started taking land and recruiting people in Syria. And so it became one of the more fraught places in the world, and remains so. You guys might have forgotten about this in 2017. The dates are off here. So Russia began the airstrike in 2015, fighting in Aleppo intensified in 2016. US bombed Syrian airport with 59 missiles just on a whim in 2017. This is how belligerent this country is. Like, I don't mean this in a bad way, but holy hell, like, we launched dozens of missiles to another country and didn't even think about it. If a missile had been launched and hit like Carson City, believe me, take it out of Nevada. If it had hit East St. Louis, believe me, the United States would have had a forceful response. But okay. So Syria became really, really volatile place, and a lot of people ended up fleeing. The vast majority were children. And so about half of the population has been displaced. Millions and millions of people internally and externally. And so a lot of these refugees started flooding to the border into Turkey, and some went back to Iraq, a couple went to other places. Canada was taking in tens of thousands of them. I think the United States took in a dozen last year, literally like less than 20. Although we had taken in many more before that. These are a lot like children, right? These are women and children, lots and lots of people that whose homes were destroyed by civil war, that a lot of people, I think, rightly attribute to in part to climate change. So the climate changed in all of these areas, but Syria was a state that was at risk of collapse, and it did. It's a threat multiplier. Okay, so one of the things that's hard to think about is how bad things can get. I think humans are really bad about thinking about things that they don't want to happen. I think that happened with coronavirus. A lot of people were sounding the alarm well before. So in December, Ellie and I were talking about it. I remember I was freaked out about this in January. But people have a hard time conceptualizing of worst case scenarios, especially when things seem so radically different from how they are now. But if climate is going to cause resources to be unstable, it is important to pay attention to the stability of governments to see how they might respond to some of this. The UN expects over 1 billion climate refugees by the end of the century. That is about 1 out of every 9 people in the world. And I think that might be a conservative estimate. So how bad could things get? Jared Diamond, famous for his book Gun, Germs, and Steel, he's an anthropologist. He wrote a book called Collapse, where he studied how some civilizations failed. And he has this fascinating image in his book where he says, imagine the person chopping down the final tree in an island, knowing that there is no future left. The crazy part about that is by the time you're chopping down the final tree on that island, there's no going back. You've made that decision a long time ago before you realized that your society was about to collapse. You destroyed your habitat well before it was obvious that you destroyed it. And so Diamond picks out these 8 traits that he thinks have caused societies to collapse in the past: deforestation, soil problems, over hunting and fishing, water management, population, invasive species. And he adds 4 more that he thinks are particularly troubling in this globalized era: climate change, environmental toxins, energy shortage, and overuse of photosynthesis. He has this quote that stuck with me. I'll just read it in full. What is the single most important environmental population problem facing the world today? People often ask. A flip answer would be the single most important problem is our misguided focus on identifying the single most important problem. That flip answer is essentially correct, because any of the dozen problems, if unsolved, would do us grave harm. And because they all interact with each other. If we solved 11 of the problems, but not the 12th, we would still be in trouble. Whichever was the problem that remained unsolved, we have to solve them all. If I shoot you with 12 bullets and you dodge 11 of them, you still got shot. That was a heavy set of topics. Um, and I want to leave you with a positive note here that uh, even though climate is a threat multiplier and that it will cause worse storms and worse fires and will increase interpersonal violence and cause the risk of countries collapsing and might cause a risk to the entire global order, it's something we're aware of. And because it's something we are aware of, it's something that we can start to try to address. We just need the political will. And honest to God, before 2 weeks ago, I didn't think that we had the political will. But holy hell, I am locked up in my house recording lectures instead of seeing all of your beautiful faces and that one ugly face. Sorry. I'm just kidding. Several ugly faces. No, sorry. Okay. No, we're completely changing society. We might cut checks for thousands of dollars to every American. We can very quickly change things. California has literally overnight solved its homelessness problem that had been plaguing it for decades. Why? Because they realize that homeless people are vectors for disease as well. And if you just rent out an entire motel, you can shelter them all, treat them all, and serve the public as well. Cities in Utah had done that, and I found that it was actually cheaper. So we can actually do this. But maybe I'll save the positive notes for later. To wrap up, we talked about health, climate issues with health, environmental racism, wildfires, increased storms, increased interpersonal violence, heat stroke, heat death, um, national security issues and fragile state issues. And all of those are things that are affected when we have a changing climate. And when the world is changing around you, it can get scary. All right, I'll see you guys later.